started. Welcome to the Share Research Consortium podcast series. We're here with Sophie Tremolet, author of the recently published Share Sanitation Markets Pathfinder paper, which outlines how economic principles can be used to improve the delivery of services along the sanitation value chain. The Pathfinder paper is available at www.shareresearch.org. In this interview, Sophie will give insights on her work on sanitation markets and financing. Welcome, Sophie.
Hello.
So, Sophie, 2.5 billion people in the world are currently living without adequate sanitation. It's estimated that only 1/5 of the total investment in the wash sector is specifically invested in sanitation. So, explain to us, how is sanitation currently funded?
Well, as you know, for water and sanitation, basically funding can come from three main different sources of funding. So it can come from private investment, and in the case of sanitation, it's households themselves, or it can come via domestic taxes, or it can come from international donors, which could be in form of taxes again, you know, if it's international governments, or from foundations, NGOs, etc. So that's what we commonly refer as the three T's. But in the case of sanitation, particularly in developing countries, there's a disproportionate emphasis on household financing. And this is because in most countries, you know, where we work in, the investment in sewers, in network sanitation, is disproportionately expensive and will not be able to be put in place in order to reach the MDGs. So therefore, the presumption is that households are, that expansion of services should be done via on-site sanitation, and very often the policy is that households are responsible for this type of investment. So therefore, the burden of investment is predominantly on households, and that is an issue because they might not have the means to finance such large investments.
Okay. So why do you think sanitation is a neglected and underfunded area more broadly, and how can current investments in sanitation be maximised? How can additional funding be secured?
So there is a need potentially for public investments in sanitation, in both on-site sanitation to support households in their investment, but also in all the systems that are needed to make those services sustainable. So for on-site, that would be in the case of transfer stations, for example, or in a fecal sludge treatment plant. For sewage, it would be, of course, for the sewage networks themselves and wastewater treatment plant. And however, one of the big problems is that sanitation is not seen as an area for investment, as a priority area for investment for a lot of governments. So there's generally a lack of political will, there's also a lack of visibility, a taboo element associated with it. At the level of households, which, as I said, are one of the key investors, there's frequently a lack of awareness and, again, a lack of prioritization of those investments compared to, you know, getting food, getting school supplies, medical supplies, etc.
Mm-hmm. So, in the Pathfinder paper, you identify sanitation market failure as one of the factors that limits universal sanitation coverage. Can you explain the concept of sanitation market failure?
Yes, so basically in the paper, what we are saying is that sanitation has to be disaggregated as a sector. It cannot be conceived as a single sector, and it's in fact a series of markets alongside the value chain, starting with, you know, the market for demand promotion, because these are services that need to be provided, and there needs to be a demand coming from households. Then there's a market for collection, so households need to demand the service, and providers need to be able to supply it to them. Then collection and treatment and reuse. So we identified a series of sub-markets which, you know, function as markets. So there's a demand and a supply side. And on both of these side of the market, there might be market failures, which mean that the provision of the services is below what would be optimal from a society's point of view. So it might be for a variety of reasons, the sort of common market failures that economists talk about. So, for example, it could be externalities, which means that, and that really applies to sanitation, which means that the impact of an economic agent's activities go beyond itself and cannot be mediated by the market. There's no price for this transaction. So pollution, for example, or the public health impact would typically be an externality, which means that if you just leave the laws of the market to rule in the context of an imperfect market, will not deliver you the right impact. Okay. Or it can be, lack of information, information asymmetry, or it could be imperfect competition, for example, when you have lots of small-scale independent providers that can actually be destructive, that can be too much competition, and therefore, your services are not provided adequately.
So what can different actors do to address these market failures, such as donors or national governments, small-scale businesses, or the communities themselves?
So there's a lot of things that can be done once these market failures have been identified, and which is why in the paper we sort of take time to sort of categorize these potential market failures, because I think it's very important to put one's finger on it. But once they've been identified, I mean, there's 3 different type of levers effectively that in particular public sector agents can take. One is, the common sort of carrot element, so providing a subsidy to influence the way in which the people are investing in the service, are demanding the service. So, for example, if households do not invest enough in their latrines or their septic tanks, so they build a septic tank, but not to the standard required to protect the groundwater table, for example, a government could provide a subsidy in order to help them reach this minimum level of quality that would, deliver a benefit for society as a whole. Or they can regulate, so that's more the stick element. And when regulating, i.e., defining rules, it's very important to enforce those rules, because in many countries rules exist, but they're not applied. And the moment you start applying them, then you see impacts. Or because these are, markets. Another possibility is to support market solutions. So that could be through facilitating access to finance for household or small-scale providers, or delivering business training skills, or providing information about the value of reuse, for example, the value of dried fecal sludge for cement production, just to give an example, so that people become aware of the possibilities and of the value that these markets can generate.
Okay. So, in conclusion, can you explain the meaning of sanitation economics?
So yes, it's a bit of a grand word, sanitation economics. I think it draws from, we talk about water economics, we've been talking about it for some time. So it's basically the application of economic approaches and ways of thinking to the study of a certain sector. So in this case, to the study of sanitation markets, and thinking in terms of incentives, in terms of risk allocation, in the way that economists think about things. Because I think there's a lot of scope for developing this area as an area of knowledge, if you want. It has been under-researched, and I think it can deliver a lot of important messages for policymakers or for the design of programs. For example, if we start understanding better what households actually invest in their household sanitation, you can then try to analyze in more effectively what kind of programs can be designed to support this investment and to trigger that investment in a way that protects the environment and delivers other benefits. So there's a need for more research in this area, and the paper actually outlines a number of critical research areas that we think are worth investigating. And there's a need to develop this on an ongoing basis as the sector develops. Okay.
All right. Thank you very much for your time, Sophie. For more details on this subject, please see the Sanitation Markets Pathfinder paper, which is accessible at www.shareresearch.org. Thank you.
Thank you.